So the final talk in this session is by Sibylle Mohr, who's based at the University of Glasgow. She's going to talk to us about disease, data and decisions using livestock movements to inform blue tongue virus restriction zones. Over to you, Sibylle.
Thank you. Hello, so today I'm going to present you some work where we analyze livestock movement data to inform possible blue tongue restriction zones from a Scottish perspective. And I think most of you are aware that blue tongue is a major concern here in the UK. And for those of you who are not familiar with blue tongue is a viral disease that affects small ruminants. It's a vector-borne disease transmitted by midges, and there is a vector-active season between March and October. So there had been a number of outbreaks on the continent, which led to an increased number of midges carrying the virus and being blown over the canal to the south and east coast of England, where we had a number, I think, up to 220 confirmed cases. And in response to the outbreak, a movement restriction zone had been put into place. And of course, movement restriction zones are very effective in limiting spread through livestock movements, but they also represent disruptions to livestock trade. So here I'm going to show you how we use actual recorded livestock movements to assess how the impacts would be on Scottish livestock trade if we were to impose different blue tongue restriction zones. So what you can see here on the right is a map, an illustrative map of Great Britain with a current blue tongue restriction zone highlighted in pink, which also covers the blue tongue high-risk counties. And in response to the incursions in England, the Scottish government had discussed whether it would be worthwhile to extend the current blue tongue restriction zone to cover most of all of England and Wales. But of course, there's a high volume of cross-border livestock trade, and so we had been asked to investigate where should the boundary be in order to minimize impacts on normal Scottish livestock movements. So we are quite fortunate here in the UK, or here Great Britain, because this is for Great Britain, that we have quite rich databases which we can explore. So there are databases for different various species where you have to record your livestock movements, farm-to-farm movements, movements via markets and across borders, and then we can exploit these data sets to do scenario-based modeling to predict any kind of disruptions ahead of time and potentially also give smarter kind of facilitate maybe smarter decisions on livestock on these restriction zones to minimize impacts on the stakeholders involved. So what you can see here on the right is an illustrative schematic of the three scenarios that we assessed. And the important thing here to remember is that livestock can move from green areas to red areas, but not the other way around. So these movement restriction zones, I might also refer here to as snap-out zones. Movements within the zones are permitted, movements to outside of the zones are restricted. And the baseline scenario, scenario one, is where the boundary is at the Scotland-England border, and the whole of Scotland is outside, and England and Wales are in the restriction zone. Scenario two, we are extending the movement restriction zone to also cover the southern counties of Scotland. And scenario three is where the northern counties of England are outside of the zone along with the rest of Scotland. So in order to do the kind of scenario-based modeling to compare impacts on Scottish livestock trade, we retrieved 6 years of data from various databases, so Scottish movements, English movements, Welsh movements for cattle and sheep. And then we measured the proportion of movements that would be permitted to the movements that would be restricted under these different scenarios. And I also wanted to mention that these databases come at different scales and different levels of detail. So some of them are individual movements, others have batched movements only. For some of the movements, markets are explicit in each record. for other databases, they're being spliced out into 2 movements. So just combining these data sets brings some challenges. And what you can see here are the trading patterns for cattle on the left and sheep on the right for these 6 years of data during the vector active season. And blue denotes movements taking place within Scotland. Movements out of Scotland are colored in green, and movements into Scotland are colored in red. And I think it's quite visible already that there are distinct patterns between the different species. So the majority of movements for cattle taking place, for Scottish cattle, taking place within Scotland, and just under 10% going out of Scotland and under 5% moving into Scotland. For sheep, it's a bit of a more mixed picture, so kind of half of it taking place within Scotland, half of it going out, and just around 8% on average going into Scotland. And so on the right, you can see a figure kind of denoting the results. So for each scenario, we show the permitted versus restricted movements, permitted in blue, restricted movements in red, and they're grouped by scenario and species. Cattle on top, sheep at the bottom. And typically, so what we find is if we include the southern counties of Scotland into a movement restriction zone, or the movement restriction zone that covers England and Wales, this has the most detrimental impact on Scottish livestock trade, with cattle being more affected. So on average, we observe an around 9% drop in permitted cattle movements. Also, I think because there's seems to be lots of trade happening between the southern counties of Scotland and the rest of Scotland. Sheep in general seem to be less affected across all scenarios, and if we exclude the northern counties of England from the England-Wales restriction zone, this has the least impact on both cattle and sheep, so most Scottish livestock trade can flow. But improvements to the kind of baseline scenario where the boundary is at the England-Scotland border, the kind of administrative boundary, improvements are quite small. Of course, if you extend blue tongue restriction zones, there might be a risk of bringing in infected animals up to the Scotland border and increasing potential spread into Scotland. So, of course, these were only livestock movement analyses, and transmission risks will also vary between these different scenarios. And so we didn't directly assess that, but we used a spatial stochastic model of blue tongue spread and control, which had been developed in EPIC by Paul Bessel a number of years ago. And it operates on farm locations and climate data, gridded climate data. And through multiple simulation runs, we find that if we seed into the high-risk counties for blue tongue in the south-east coast of England, we only rarely observe significant outbreaks in Scotland. But timing matters, so typically the kind of late spring, early summer is estimated to be kind of the highest time of risk for this. And of course, what also matters for these different scenarios that we assessed, if infections reach these northern counties of England or the southern counties of Scotland, onwards transmission into Scotland is of course higher. So I just wanted to conclude with saying, hopefully you've seen we can exploit real data to maybe find a more balanced approach and a trade disease control approach, and also maybe make smarter decisions for these kind of boundaries, not necessarily relying on administrative borders, although administrative borders sometimes may be the way to go. And also just looking ahead, so some of these data sets are not as good as others, and hopefully, you know, they're getting better and better. So if we have finer grained real-time data, I think maybe in the future we can also use that for more dynamic restriction zoning, using adaptive policies based on evolving risk patterns. And not to be left out of the discussion about machine learning, although we didn't use machine learning here, of course you could also integrate these kind of real-time data with machine learning methods, but this might require a more multi-level data approach, so environmental data sets, farm densities, livestock densities, and so on. Thank you for your attention. I wanted to say thank you to my collaborators in EPIC, to the Animal Health and Welfare Division at the Scottish Government, and our data providers at ScotID and APHA.
Thank you, Sibylle.